Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. It was 5 years ago that I heard the name of the Norwegian author Tarjei Vesaas for the first time. I read The Ice Palace first, and it just completely blew me away. This is a very brief text. It's a novella, and it is a very quiet novella in many ways. So it's amazing how it impacted me and how it marked me as a reader. I think it's mainly because it has the power of a vision, even the power of a myth. Works like that really have the power to evoke strange and suggestive feelings in you. So I think this is what The Ice Palace did for me. Now, I have just finished reading the novel The Birds by Vesaas, so I thought I would put together a video sharing with you my impressions as a reader on these texts at the same time. I want to make clear that I could talk about each one of these books for hours, but I thought this compare-contrast was the best way to approach them for this video and the best way for me to share my ideas with you on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go by chronological order. First I'm going to talk about The Birds, then I'm going to talk about The Ice Palace, and then finally I'm going to look at some common denominators between these two, and also to share with you some ideas about the author and his style and all those sorts of things. So let's get started. The Birds was published in 1957, and the first thing that struck me about it is its narrative economy. We have only 3 main characters here, and we have a unity of place also to it. The action takes place in an isolated house near a small town, and we have the characters of Mattis, who has mental disabilities, his sister Hege, who takes care of him, and then later on in the novel, the figure that enters into the action is the lumberjack Jürgen, who basically forces the other characters to re-examine their lives and to make some changes. Jürgen is the figure of the worker. Hege, for her part, is the figure of the realist, and Mattis represents the dreamer. He's the one who is always trying to look for omens and trying to interpret the world around him and having lots of difficulty with that. He might, for instance, read meaning into a bird flying over his house. There you have the title of The Birds, right? So these are some things to keep in mind about these 3 characters. Now, because of its subject matter, the first thing that you think about are what other books in the world of literature depict mental disabilities. And of course, the first ones that came to my mind were William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, with the character of Benji, and then John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, with the character of Lenny. So The Birds is continuing or adding itself to that tradition. One of the main themes, or perhaps one of the most obvious themes that you can see in The Birds, has to do with the ties that bind people together. So when you read this novel, you really want to explore concepts like love and jealousy. Now, there are some fantastic questions to start a book club discussion of The Birds. For instance, does Hege love Mattis? Does Jürgen love Hege? This will yield very, very good discussion if you are looking at The Birds as a group. But jealousy is definitely present there, specifically in the character of Mattis. He has always been taken care of by his sister, and then all of a sudden you have this character of the lumberjack Jürgen who enters the scene. So there's competition all of a sudden, and that is something that he tries to find a way to deal with, but of course the situation is very difficult for him because he is completely dependent on his sister. Now, the first question that I asked myself, a question that The Birds raises, is, should we live for ourselves or should we live for others? I think the novel is trying to tell us that we should try to find a balance between these 2 options, right? If you live completely for yourself, if you're completely selfish, you do not find fulfillment. But on the other hand, if your life is completely based on other people, if everything you do is, to support someone else, or, you're basically living your life for other people 100%, as Hege does in a way in this novel, then that's not a good thing either. So this is a very crucial question that we have in this novel, and that is wonderful to explore through The Birds. Another thing that the novel explores is the need for connection. This is a very basic, very human need, and the characters, all 3 of them, you can see that they are desperate for connection. The big irony is, of course, that they are incredibly close to each other, they're right next to each other, but at the same time, they are worlds apart. They're trying to connect, but they're just not doing a very good job when it comes to that, which is what happens in real life, unfortunately, many times. So, finally, another theme that I explore with the birds is the inescapable world of adulthood, specifically the ideas of duty and responsibility. Duty and responsibility are in many ways the tenets of the adult world. So we have Hege, for instance, taking care of her brother Mattis out of a sense of filial duty and responsibility. Now, this is a very important theme because it's going to be present also in the Ice Palace. So keep in mind that this is something that Vesaas seems to like to explore. I cannot speak for his other novels because I have only read The Birds and the Ice Palace, but I would certainly look out for that in the work of Tarjei Vesaas as a whole. Moving on to the Ice Palace, this one was published in 1963, and it is not a novel, it's a novella. I'm going to share with you some ideas on what that means in a couple of minutes. Here you also have great narrative economy. We have three main characters, the 11-year-old girls Siss and Unn, and Unn's aunt, right? Now, Auntie is not really a main character. I mention her because she is important, but I see her more as a catalyst, or better yet, as an influencer. She influences the choices and the feelings of the two girls. So that's my take on the character of Auntie. As the novel begins, I feel that the novel begins in a wonderful way. Siss is getting ready to visit Unn, her new friend, for the first time. This is just an amazing way to begin the novella. It brought me back completely to the world of childhood and the many times that I had this experience, going for the first time to a friend's house. You were wondering, what are we gonna eat? Is the house big? Is the apartment very small? Do they have a Nintendo? Are his parents weird? That kind of thing. So I completely experienced that through the novella of the Ice Palace. All the feeling of expectation and also of anxiety involved with that first visit. And during that first visit, Siss and Unn have an encounter. They are inside Unn's bedroom, and not much really happens, but we feel that there's an encounter taking place there, not only at the physical plane, but more at the spiritual level, right? Because the girl, specifically Siss, is completely marked by this moment, and we don't know exactly why. This is a characteristic of the novella. I'm going to go into that in a couple of minutes. But there's something happening here at the spiritual level, definitely. That's the way that I read it. And that is why this encounter is so important. It's the first important moment in the novella. So it's something to keep in mind there. Now, after this encounter, which moves both girls in different ways, but very profound ways, Unn decides to visit an ice structure that she was going to visit with her class in probably a few days, if I remember correctly. She decides to go there by herself, and she just falls asleep there and disappears. That is the beginning of the, novella in itself. So we have immediately the townspeople starting a search for the missing girl. The Ice Palace is mainly, or in certain ways, about the search for something lost. Now let's talk a little bit about the novella as a genre. The first thing I say about the novella is that it does not spell things out for the reader. It suggests and lets the reader do the work. I think the best image to describe the novella is like a pebble thrown into a pond. You just throw a little pebble into a pond and you can see all these series of ripples expanding and expanding. That is what the novella does. It's a pebble thrown into a pond, and then you have to look at the ripples and see how far they go. Another important thing about the novella is that the plot is not really an important, or let me put it this way, it's not really the main thing about it. It's not the main narrative element. Sometimes you will find that there is plot in a novella, but it is not the principal aspect of the text. The best example would be Kafka's Metamorphosis, right? Think about this text. Nothing really happens, per se. From the very beginning, you have a character who wakes up and realizes that he has been turned somehow into a gigantic bug, and the entire novella deals with what he does in order to cope with this situation. That is a typical novella structure. You don't really have a plot there. It's just a situation that is presented to us and re-examined throughout the text. That is what the novella does. Re-examine a given situation as opposed to what the novel or the short story might do to develop a certain plot or a certain character or things like that. You can see suggestion in the encounter that I already mentioned between Siss and Unn. Once again, we are not told specifically why the girls have this weird feeling about this encounter. There is nothing there that tells the reader, look, they felt strange about it or weird about it because of this. No, we are meant to interpret that ourselves and to develop that encounter ourselves. The novella merely suggests, right? Now, The Ice Palace I read as a doppelgänger story. I feel like this encounter that takes place between Siss and Unn is basically an encounter between the same person or between two sides of the same person. And this interpretation would be supported by the scene where the girls are looking at each other in a mirror. They're just seeing each other there reflected, and at one point they feel like they're interchangeable. It's like there's an interchangeability there between the two girls. The one looking, we don't know who she is because that's part of the thing going on here. She feels like she could be the other one and vice versa. So I feel that basically what's happening here is that two aspects of one person are coming together, and that would be an explanation of why the encounter is such a weird one for them and why it affects them the way it does. I don't remember who it was that said that the definition of friendship is one soul in two different bodies. I think in a sense that is what is going on here. The novella is exploring those instances where I hope you had this experience yourself. I certainly did. When you meet somebody at the friendship level, of course, and you just feel an instant connection with them. You feel that you see the world in similar ways. It's that, connection, that instant connection. And that is what happens to Siss and Unn, to the extent that they are almost seeing the same person when they look at each other. And there are, times in the novella later on when some of the characters remark that Siss resembles Unn physically also. So we have that going on there. I could not help thinking of Ingmar Bergman's film Persona. So I'll let you explore that on your own, but that is one connection, one of the many connections that I made as I was reading The Ice Palace. So going back to the concept of plot, we don't really have a plot, but we have the re-examination of a given situation. Now, what is it that is re-examined in The Ice Palace? And there are many answers to this question, and it depends on how you approach the novella, right? But two ideas that I thought about could be re-examined through this text are keeping a secret or keeping a promise, which is what Siss is trying to do. It is not clear what secret or what promise she is keeping. That's part of the suggestive nature of the novella. And also the notion of keeping a memory alive. That is what Siss does throughout the novella. In a sense, she's trying to get away from that memory, and the memory does not let her do that. But that is constantly something that the novella keeps coming back to, that this specific novella, the narrator in The Ice Palace, keeps coming back to these ideas. Keeping a secret or keeping a promise, and also the inability to escape this memory on the part of Siss. Now, if somebody asked me, so what is the Ice Palace? How would you describe it? I would say this is a symbolic or even an allegorical coming-of-age story. And as such, I would compare it to Alice in Wonderland. I would compare it to Valerie and her Week of Wonders. And if we leave aside the issue of gender for a moment, I would even compare it to Hermann Hesse's Demian. Of course, these are very different texts. Their narrative purposes are very different, but this is ultimately what we are dealing with. We have here a girl who is struggling to leave behind girlhood and to transition into young adulthood or young womanhood, right? There are many other themes also. One that I always like to explore is lasting encounters, those encounters that mark us, right? There are encounters in life, meetings with certain people that simply define us for life. And this would be an example. It would be a great novella to explore that issue. And also, of course, one of my favorite topics ever is the permanence of the past, how the past continues to exist in the present. And this is one of the concepts that psychoanalysis is based on. The idea that our childhood is something that continues to affect us and to influence us throughout our lives. So look for that also in the Ice Palace. I'm also very moved by the central image, which is naturally the Ice Palace, right? What does it mean? Well, it's a very interesting image in itself, because the Ice Palace, the place where Unn falls asleep, and later where Siss goes, is an enclosure, right? So the moment you think of an enclosure, you think of this idea of comfort, but at the same time, it's a cold place. It's very interesting what Tarjei Vesaas does with this image. Is it a womb? Is it an anti-womb? Once again, the novella suggests, and you decide how you interpret those elements. In this case, the central symbol of the novella, which is, of course, the Ice Palace. So let's talk a little bit about common denominators. And the first one that I find is the concept of guilt. You can see it there in the character of Hege, who takes care of her brother mainly or largely out of a sense of guilt, which is connected to her sense of duty. Mattis, also from the birds, also feels guilt, especially when he talks to other young girls. This is something that the narrator keeps coming back to. And then in the Ice Palace, of course, Siss is plagued by a sense of guilt after what happens to Unn at the beginning of the novella. So I think in both cases, in both texts, the birds and the Ice Palace, we have this concept of guilt present there. I also like to look at the struggle in these two texts of those who are left outside of the adult world. In one case, we have people who have mental disabilities, which is the case of Mattis in the birds, and in the Ice Palace, we have the young, or the child, who is still not part of the adult world. This is through an inability or through a refusal to adapt, right? And in different cases, you have inability or refusal. You could speak of inability in the birds and maybe refusal in the Ice Palace. So that's one way to look at it. And one thing that Mattis says a lot in the birds, speaking about Hege, is she understood nothing, or she had not understood. And it's interesting, but in the Ice Palace, at one point, Siss says the same thing about her parents after they interrogate her when she comes back from visiting Unn. They understood nothing. So here you have clearly illustrated the disconnect that exists between, one side of the issue and the other, between the adult world and the person who is not able or who refuses to enter into that adult world. One way that I like to look at this is thinking of the world maybe as a text, or reality or society as a text, and adulthood is the official and the imposed interpretation of that text. So anybody who has a personal interpretation or who refuses to accept that interpretation is left outside, because by the system he or she is considered to be useless. They do not adapt. So the system has no use for them. They do not accept the official and the imposed interpretation of the text. They persist in interpreting this text in their own ways, and that's not acceptable. And to conclude, I just wanted to share with you my impressions on Vesaas based on the two texts by him that I have read. Let me say this, he's one of the most original authors that I have encountered. He reminds me in that sense of Clarice Lispector, of course, very different authors in many ways, but they share that, how can I say this? I think they are untainted in a sense by any prefabricated notions of style that characterize, I feel, the vast majority of authors. Sometimes you read them and you're like, where are they coming from? Like literally, where do they come from? What kind of texts are they coming from? And it's very difficult to establish that because they have a very personal style and a very personal voice. The themes have been explored by other authors. Okay, you have a sort of a love triangle in the birds, you have a doppelgänger story and many other things in the Ice Palace. These are themes and modes that have been explored many times by many authors, but Vesaas has a very personal way of doing that. My definition of the concept of originality is a personal inimitable way of looking at the world and the human condition. That is how I would define originality in an author. Every author is basically reading the text of the world and then conveying to you as a reader his or her interpretation of that text. So I feel that when we call an author original, when we say this is a very original author, what we are recognizing is an ability to read this text of the world in a way that is unique, that is relatable, that is interesting. So that's what I mean when I say that Vesaas is, to me, an original author. If you are new to the work of Tarjei Vesaas, I recommend beginning with The Ice Palace and then moving on to The Birds. I feel that if you do it that way, if you start with the novella and then move on to the novel, you will have a much better appreciation of The Birds. And remember that The Birds is the novel that Karl Ove Knausgård called the best Norwegian novel ever written. I don't know enough about Norwegian literature. I haven't read enough Norwegian literature to say whether I agree with him or not, but this is, by all standards, an excellent novel. So I do recommend The Birds, but I would urge you to read The Ice Palace first if you haven't done that yet. My next novel by Vesaas, I think, will be The Bridges. I'm interested in the topic, and it seems to be his next most important one after these two. I would love to hear your thoughts on these texts if you have read them, or even, on anything that I said in this video. So please feel free to comment and to join the discussion. Those are my thoughts on Tarjei Vesaas, specifically on The Birds and The Ice Palace. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.